The ground there. Well, at one point they were respectively the great Satan and part of the axis of evil, but the US and Iran have held initial discussions on how best to cooperate to stall the rapid jihadist advances in Iraq. And also here in the UK, the government's announced it's reopening the British embassy in Tehran. So is Iraq's pain providing an opportunity perhaps to rehabilitate Iran? There's a question. Well, Trita Parsi is the president of the National Iranian-American Council, is in Washington. And Dr Roham Alvandi is a historian of Iran and assistant professor of international history at the London School of Economics, is in our Oxford studio. Gentlemen, thank you both for joining us. Trita Parsi, if I could start with you. From great Satan to great mates, by be a slight exaggeration, is this a case, though, of needs must? They have to work closely together?
They do. But the political obstacles to explore those common interests have just been too big. At this point, however, with the onslaught of ISIS, it seems like the cost of not pursuing the common interest has become simply too great.
Roham Alvandi, was this something that was going to happen and we've just been given the trigger, or has it really been a case of having to rush something out? Because this is a pretty desperate state of affairs, isn't it?
It is a very desperate state of affairs, but I think it's the détente between the US and Iran has been a very delicate and slow process, and up till now the US and Iran have both been quite careful to separate the nuclear issue from these regional issues, but given the impending humanitarian disaster that the spate of ISIS victories represents, I think they have been forced now to contemplate cooperation in the regional sphere, complementing the talks that are going on in Vienna on the nuclear issue.
Well, I suppose, Trita Parsi, one of the key issues here, and it's in the background of your shot, in fact, is, of course, Washington, is Congress, and how far domestically the Obama administration would be allowed to go in terms of a warmer relationship with Iran.
There's going to be some significant difficulties, particularly when it comes to the lifting of sanctions, that inevitably will have to be some part of a final nuclear deal. But realities on the ground has in large parts overtaken this rivalry that has existed between the United States and Iran for the last 30 years. By now, the rivalry is continuing autopilot, even though the circumstances on the ground are fast shifting. It seems now, though, that people are catching up to this and realizing that it's to their own detriment not to explore the common interest.
But from that point of view, I suppose, Roham Alvandi, have the United States and Tehran, I guess, or even the West and Tehran, allowed themselves to sleepwalk into the position where Iraq it's virtually a busted flush before they get to do anything now?
Well, I mean, my point of view is that the United States is not really calling the shots in terms of what's going on in the region. It's being driven primarily by the collapse of the Iraqi state and by local actors, especially Iran and Saudi Arabia. And what's even more important in many ways than cooperation between Iran and the United States is some sort of dialogue and cooperation between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Because if that doesn't happen, this Sunni-Shia sectarian divide has the potential to reap unthinkable horror.
But does Washington then become a bystander in that Saudi-Iranian discussion?
Well, they have a role to play in terms of the relationship they have with Saudi Arabia, and no doubt that was something that Iranian Foreign Minister Javad Zarif, I'm sure, raised with William Burns in their meeting in Vienna. But the reality is that given the domestic constraints that the President Obama faces, given the situation that Britain faces, it really is up to the local actors, especially Iran and Saudi Arabia, to show leadership and begin a dialogue with each other in order to reduce the tensions in the region.
We've talked about the domestic pressure on the Obama administration there, but what about the situation for Hassan Rouhani, Trita Parsi? Does this situation make life harder for him, or perhaps eases things up a little for him. He's got to act.
It appears as if they're seeing this as an opportunity to be able to make the case to the United States that the dialogue between the two need to expand beyond just a nuclear issue. But reality is that there are people, strong elements on both sides, that are simply addicted to the idea of having this enemy, whether it is the Iranians who cannot envision themselves in a region without having the Great Satan as the enemy, or elements on the American side that argue that we have to go into Iraq again now in order to make sure it doesn't fall into Iranian hands. Whatever the analysis is, Iran always ends up being the enemy. Those elements are strong, but I think they're not as strong as they used to be because facts on the ground are just shifting very, very quickly right now.
Right, and facts, if we can finish perhaps, Roham Alvandi, facts in history suggest there is no easy route, is there, in terms of Iranian-American relations or indeed relations with the West. We can go back a long way before we had what we would see as stability, and certainly not with the regime we have at the moment. What chance?
Well, I think we shouldn't be too pessimistic because we are fortunate to have a very pragmatic and very competent government in power in Tehran. And this crisis has come in the midst of a détente between the US and Iran. So we are in a much better position to deal with this situation than we would have been 4 or 5 years ago with different administrations in power, both in Tehran and in Washington. So I am optimistic that both Tehran and Washington, but also the other actors in the region, can take some steps to avert what looks to be an absolutely horrific situation unfolding.
Yeah, well, Roham Alvandi of the London School of Economics and also Trita Parsi from the National Iranian-American Council. Thank you both.